It's a great pleasure to be with you. I think this is a really excellent initiative that I'm very pleased to be part of. I wanted to talk about the impact of technology on society and what we can expect in the coming decade, which I think is going to be a decade where, just as with other big industries that over the years have become regulated, governments around the world are going to consider how we go about regulating technology. Now, we've had, in the early 1900s in America, action was taken to break up the big trust monopoly companies, the oil and steel and railroad sectors. We've seen those sorts of investigations in the media sector really since the, actually I think probably the first one was after the Second World War, in the antitrust investigation into the tied relationship between the Paramount movie studio and the cinema chains that it owned, where it's very difficult to release a film if it wasn't made by a major studio because they controlled all the cinemas, and that was considered to be anti-competitive. There were then antitrust cases against the Bell telephone company in America, and then Microsoft. We've seen some antitrust investigations against Microsoft and Google in Europe. And so I think these investigations into monopoly power and abuse of market power by big technology companies will be one of the major agendas we look at. Alongside that will be the question of understanding what the societal harms are of hate speech and disinformation and conspiracy theories, images of self-harm ripping through social media. We've been discussing some of these issues for a while, particularly as it relates to electoral interference. There was obviously in 2017 a big interest in Russian interference in elections, particularly the American presidential election. There have been a number of studies done looking at Russian interference in elections across Europe, from European parliamentary elections to national elections. And obviously there are big national elections in Germany this year. And again, there'll be a lot of interest in external disinformation campaigns and election interference to try and interfere with the democratic process. We've seen European society become far more polarized, just as it has been in America. And people question whether echo chambers on social media are part of the cause. So people see a much less plural news now. They tend to see more of the same as they consume more and more news through social media. We've seen as well in the extraordinary last week, the way in which big tech companies feel quite happy to stand up to national governments if they don't like what they're doing, in the way that Facebook has sought to take on Australia as a democratic society, with a parliament seeking to legislate in what it considers to be its national interest in standing up to that. In the last year, particularly this year of COVID, I think people have really started to focus on whether disinformation on social media platforms really changes things. I think a year or so ago, a lot of people would have said, well, does this stuff on Facebook, does anyone really pay any attention? Does anyone really notice? But then we've seen the emergence of COVID conspiracy theories, a new issue people weren't talking about before, 5G phone masts being burned down because people thought they were spreading coronavirus. Studies across Europe have shown, certainly in the period leading up to December, before the first vaccines were launched, a growing distrust of vaccines in Europe, particularly in France, where at one point I think half of people in polling research were saying they wouldn't take it. We saw this extraordinary campaign in America where, which after polling day in the election, between that and just before the inauguration, about 75% of people who voted Republican believed there had been a mass fraud in the election to defraud Donald Trump of being re-elected. We're seeing we've seen a genocide organized on Facebook in Myanmar, lynchings in India, and an insurrection in America. And so it is changing the way people behave. And that's why it has come within the regulatory scope of Parliament. So we see the European Commission through the Digital Services Act, the UK government through the Online Harms Bill, Australia through its competition investigations, in America now under the new Biden administration, calls for reform of the law which will end the platform neutrality from legal liability. And we're seeing all these things happening, these great initiatives, born out of a concern of the impact. But just going back to Australia as well, I mean, it's understandable why the Australians have taken this issue to heart so seriously. In Australia, Google and Facebook combined control 80% of the advertising market. Newspapers have seen their ad revenues decline by 50% since 2006. So governments need to respond to some of these issues. And what's interesting is Facebook's response to the problem. They see it as a clash of ideas. It's not a question of how much they should pay or whether they should pay at all, but their vision of how they think the internet works, and therefore how they think their government, their company works, and their view that that is more important than what a government thinks. And the challenge, I think, that comes from companies that really see the world as being a set of rules based within their own walled garden, which they control, and actually, and where governments are secondary. Now, we see that power developing rapidly in the information environment, both in attracting more people's attention, but also in disrupting the business models of traditional publishers that can no longer rely on advertising to fund their work. We will see this disruption elsewhere as well. I think we'll increasingly see this in television as more viewers switch away from national broadcasters, traditional linear broadcasters, to consuming content on demand on services like Amazon Prime and Netflix. We will see that continued disruption in television too. But what about in banking? You know, what will happen when Facebook, as it is threatening to do and is planning to do, launches its own currency? You know, people start trading in, as a matter of course, in cryptocurrencies and electronic currencies that aren't supervised by central banks, that are totally out of the remit of the institutions that protect us against, or try to protect us against, fraud and misdealing. You know, what will the world be like then? So I think we're at a very pivotal moment where national parliaments and governments have got to recognise that this is an industry that needs some external regulation to protect the consumer interest and to protect competition in these spaces as well. And if we don't, we will see these companies become ever more dominant and have really no kind of external supervision or control by national governments at all. And this is an issue we have to confront. Now, some people say, if you even mention these things out loud, that somehow you're anti-tech. And people say, well, you know, aren't companies like Amazon popular? You know, aren't companies like Facebook popular? Don't people want to use them? So what's the problem? I don't think it's about being anti-tech. I think it'd be a bit like saying you're anti-car because you believe that seatbelts are a good idea. Or that you're somehow anti-energy industry because you think, you know, there should be, you know, a polluter pays principle if there's an oil leak. You know, or you're anti-drugs because you think there should be regulations around pharmaceutical trials. In most other industries, we set in place regulation to protect the consumer interest and environmental interests, and to ensure there's fair play. And that's what we need to do now. And be very interested to discuss those thoughts with you today.